All righty, you all, let's go ahead and get started. Folks will continue to join us as they're able. I have the pleasure of facilitating this conversation and being in space with these wonderful folks here today for our webinar on centering Black immigrant survivors in the work. My name is Ayana Wallace View. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the training and technical assistance managers with Ujima Inc. Ujima Inc. is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. We are one of very few nationally designated, culturally specific resource centers. And we really are always excited to think through the different identities that we have within the Black community. How do we really make sure we're centering folks and what our needs are? And so we wanted to take a look at really a deeper look at the experiences of Black immigrants, how we as advocates can be more supportive, understand needs better, understand what access means, and really looking at anti-Blackness specifically today. And so I want to welcome our four guests. We're going to start out with my colleague, Araba Edu Apau. Thank you for joining us. Araba is our senior research lead and also runs our research and evaluation work group. So all the congrats to you for all the research that you do, and I always really think about your background, which I'm going to have you share in a second. So I always get excited for these conversations with you. So thank you for joining us. We have next up Lucane LaFortune, who is the Deputy Director of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. Shout out to y'all. We have some strings and connections there too. Thank you, Lucane, for joining us. I'm going to have you introduce yourself and how you got into the work in just a moment. Nawai Wayesa, who is the case manager and outreach specialist with the Person Center, who we love. Nawai is a little under the weather, but is here with us today, trucking it out, but may need to be off and on camera. So we're going to let you do your thing, Nawai. Thank you for joining. And then last but not least, Allison Messenger, who's the staff attorney with Genesis Center, who again, we love and have these different connections and threads with all these different programs. So thank you all for joining us. Araba, if you want to get started just by telling folks who you are, sort of a little bit about your background, and then how you got into the work, and then Lucane will go to you next.
Sure. Thank you, Ayana, for that introduction. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Araba Edu Apau. Like Ayana said, I'm the Senior Research Specialist at Ujima Inc. and oversee all things research and evaluation at Ujima. And I'm super excited for today's conversation because of my background. I have an education background in political science and Africana studies. I'm currently a PhD student at Howard University, the illustrious Howard University, the Mecca. And I am a student at the Department of African Studies, and I have a focus in diaspora engagement. I'm currently studying or focusing on Ghana's 2019 year of return and how we can bridge gaps within the diaspora. And so that's why I'm super excited about this conversation, is because this is the work that I do. And I love conversations like this, so I hope it doesn't end here. And I got into this work because I've always been passionate about advocating for the Black community. And Ujima at the time had a lot of buzz online, especially. And so running across the organization, speaking with people like Ayana and a few other of the organization members, I knew that this would be the home for me. So yes, so excited to speak with each and every one of you and also learn from each of you in the work that you do, as well as the audience members as well.
Great. Okay, I have to follow that. Hello, everybody. My name is Lucane LaFortune, and I am the Deputy Director at Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. And I am originally from Haiti, and I wanted to bring my two ancestors to this space, which is my grandmother, Blanche Ismayon, and also my, my grandmother, paternal grandmother, and then my maternal grandmother, which is Italia Israel. I think it's important for us to bring in our ancestors whenever we're in certain spaces and we're talking about our cultures and how it impacts our work. I came into this work actually really from the time I was a little kid. I don't talk about this all the time, but I remember the first time I heard or thought I heard violence was when my paternal grandmother was being abused by her husband, her second husband. And I compared to when a child first hears, a really loud noise or something that they can't explain or they've never heard before, a force of nature or something like that. And I'll never forget that to this day. And so that's one of the reasons that I decided to do my work in domestic violence. And also, I'm currently a mama of a very spunky girl. She's 9. Her birthday is next Tuesday. Oh my God, that's all we talk about. And I'm currently a doctoral student as well. And my focus is on fat phobia and fat studies in general and how it impacts the educational experiences of Black women. So I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Look, I just want to take a quick pause to like shout out our PhD students and like all the work that y'all just casually slide that in there, right? Like that's a lot of work and like kudos to y'all because y'all are really doing it. And 9 years old already. Wait a minute, yes. Hold on. That's going too fast. Thank you. Let's go with Nawai and then Allison.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I have to off my camera. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I have to make this happen. It is still a pleasure and honor to be a participant in this panel discussion. So again, my name is Nawai Wayesa. I am a case manager and outreach specialist with the Person Center. And so I am a first generation immigrant from Ethiopia. And I am a proud Black African immigrant woman. And of course, I came to this work because I'm a survivor and I would love to advocate for my fellow African immigrants. And because I have faced so many challenges and I don't want to no one face that challenge, and I would love everyone to be treated equally as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Nawai. Allison?
Good afternoon. My name is Allison Messenger, and I am the managing staff attorney with Genesee Center, which is based in South Los Angeles. It's a domestic violence intervention and prevention program with a culturally specific focus on Black women survivors. And how I got into the work, I started my career as an attorney with the district attorney's office in LA County, and enjoyed really working with survivors of domestic violence, but I realized that I needed to do it in a way that could really be impactful and make a difference. And that wasn't happening in the work that I was doing with the district attorney's office. And so I gravitated away from that. And when I had the opportunity to join Genesee Center's team, I jumped at the opportunity to work with an organization that is led by Black women. So I've been with Genesee Center since 2002, overseeing their legal services program, providing direct legal services in the areas of immigration and family law. And again, just really honored and excited to be part of this discussion today.
Yes, so I am a jump-in person, as some of you know. I think let's get right to some of these questions because we have a lot to talk through potentially. And so the first question I wanted to sort of pose to you all, and we can take it wherever it goes, but when we talk about, or when we say Black immigrant experience, what comes to mind for you all in terms of stigmas? What come to mind in terms of like narratives about Black immigrant survivors? What comes to mind? And anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So when you said stigmas, automatically I thought about the stigmas that are attached to Black immigrants when they immigrate to the US. And oftentimes those stigmas kind of exclude the actual real life experiences of immigrants. So I know for African immigrants, oh, and I don't think I disclosed this, but I'm Ghanaian American, so I'm first generation. So my parents immigrated from Ghana in the 80s. And although I was born on American soil, I'm always going to claim I'm African. Okay. But yes, so generally speaking, I think especially for the West African community, there are stigmas that paint Africans as like hardworking overachievers who come here to like take jobs from people. And once they do get those jobs, they kind of like look down upon others, especially given like their new socioeconomic status or whatever that may be. And then also there's a stigma that holds that African immigrants do not understand the plight of Black America because they are somewhat removed from the experiences and the structural racism that occurs on the US. And I think that can kind of have an impact for Black immigrants because I think also there's a lot of context left out of that. And then also there's real identities that are excluded and not, validated. Although African immigrants have different experiences, we also have certain experiences that are very similar in nature, right? If I'm getting pulled over by the cops, I don't think they're going to stop to distinguish if I'm African or African American. And so, yeah, I think certain stigmas that can be very harmful and impactful to the African immigrant community and kind of can exclude them from some of the injustices that are faced throughout the diaspora.
Thank you. Other folks?
Yeah, I would add that English proficiency or just being able to speak English in general in a way that people that's acceptable to people is often seen as is compared to intelligence. And so people believe that oftentimes that Black immigrants are not intelligent for a lot of different ways, right? It's very layered. One, because you're Black, but also because you may not be proficient in English. And so there are lots of assumptions that people hold about language in general, right? As not being educated or intelligent as native English speakers. And that experience follows us from the time that we are, whether we immigrate here, from the small, young age to all the way when like in the doctoral program or even in the workspace where you're being corrected all the time, regardless of whether or not you have a doctoral program, you'll have a doctorate or you're in a doctoral program, that people don't necessarily look at that. They look at the English proficiency. And one of my wonderful mentors told me, look, this is how you get over that stigma, because I still, this is something that I think that's made a really huge impact on me. And so what she said to me is, if you can't remember how to say it in English, say it in your language, the first language that you can remember, because people don't actually see it as a strength. They see it as a weakness that you're able to speak multiple languages, right? So we don't really see it that way. People tend to go straight to English, because English obviously is seen as the language to be spoken. And we know that, and we're not going to go into that because that could be a whole other conversation, but due to imperialism, we know that people often believe that English is more important than other languages. So that's the other
thing. And I was even just thinking about accents, just like, even if you are speaking English and what your accent sounds like to different people. I was watching, I saw, it was a quick YouTube clip or something, and a Jamaican woman was saying how she had been asked to translate Jamaican, like she had a Jamaican accent, but English for her mother to English. And she was like, that's a weird concept. But again, how accents, like people just, when they hear an accent, sometimes automatically are like, nope, I don't have time to try to figure out what you're saying, so I'm gonna ignore what you're saying. And that's often what it becomes. So
I would also add, though, it depends. If it's a British accent, which also aligns with English, if it's a British accent, it's also seen as superior as well. So it all depends on that. Even
And
accents have
yeah,
sort of hierarchy as well.
yeah,
So.
and that point though is I was just thinking about that with French and how so many African or Haitian or just people across the diaspora might speak French, and even still it's not taken with the same esteem as someone who's not Black speaking that language. So yeah.
Exactly.
Any other thoughts?
I was just going to jump in and add that from the perspective of someone who works in the space of providing assistance to survivors, Black immigrant survivors face the stigma of being invisible, particularly when we talk about immigration and immigration services. And I think for me, that really was an aha moment in 2021 when we saw the images of Haitian immigrants being rounded up by Border Patrol agents on horseback, and it sparked a national conversation. But in Los Angeles, specifically in the immigration services provider space, there was no commentary, no discussion about the experiences of Black immigrants. And that's true. They are just not at the table. Their needs certainly aren't being centered. And so I think the plight for many Black immigrant survivors is just invisibility and just no recognition that they have specific needs and intersecting needs that should be centered and lifted up and require specific responses.
Absolutely, thank you.
Also, I just want to add into that, but you all said being undermined and undertreated, and no matter how educated you are, you have a PhD, you have a master's, or whatever that is, as a newcomers and as an African immigrant came to this country, it takes a lot of time and effort that we have to go through. And it's really hard to get even survivor job. When I say survivor job, and like any kind of job. So that leads our community suffer more, which is mental health. And so definitely the first thing that come to my mind is, being undermined and negative thoughts that, you all said. How we can prove that and how we can make sure that we are not capable to do. Of course, we have to prove that, but it takes a lot of time and effort. So yeah, you all say that, but just addition to that.
Thank you. And that actually sort of gets me to my next question. And then we'll go into thinking about how it shows up throughout the diaspora. But can you all talk to us about what anti-Blackness is, what it looks like, how it shows up? Because to Nawai's point, I sort of see it as, when you're undermined because you're an immigrant and a Black immigrant and all these other layers, that's a very clear example to me of anti-Blackness. But can you sort of mesh it out for folks?
So and bear with me because I'm not necessarily going to give a straightforward answer, but I'm going to kind of describe how I've seen anti-Blackness perpetuated throughout like certain movements and certain ideologies. And, anti-Blackness at its root stems from white supremacy and is, derives from the division that caused division due to the enslavement of Africans, right? And so you have what has become diaspora wars, or what we've witnessed like a disturbance within the diaspora where the lack of knowledge due to the division has caused people within the diaspora to kind of like not identify as one people and to kind of separate themselves. And for me, it's kind of disheartening because when you understand when you know the roots of like Pan-Africanism, right? Kwame Nkrumah was very adamant about the unification of African nations in order to achieve liberation, in order to mobilize effectively, in order to rest in our power or understand our power, is through unity. And so what anti-Blackness does is it causes division and separation, especially when we perpetuate it within our own communities and within the diaspora. And so I've seen anti-Blackness operate in ways where like communities will have certain notions or tropes or stigmas or stereotypes about other groups. So for example, one common thing I've heard that like Africans hold is like they look down upon African Americans, or you might have heard sentiments that hold African Americans are ghetto or whatever. And these tropes and these narratives further drive anti-Blackness within our communities, right? And so to me, anti-Blackness is more than just the ideology, but we see it throughout movements and we see it throughout like social behaviors. And also featureism, colorism, those are other anti-Black mechanisms that we've seen to kind of help drive people of the diaspora further apart. And also like what comes to mind is, I don't know if anyone is familiar with like the ADOS movement. And for those who don't know, ADO stands for African Descendants of Slaves, if I'm saying it correctly. And I remember watching that movement very closely, especially when it had like kind of just came out. But one of the goals of the ADOS movement was to receive reparations, those who were descendants of those who had history with American chattel slavery. And, I love the whole fact that they were championing for reparations. But I remember at a certain point, the conversation led to Africans being the enemy because they were responsible for selling slaves into, the slave trade. And so I just started to say, what's the goalpost here? Are we fighting for reparations? Are we fighting for the advancement of Black people? Or are we being divisive within our community? So that's how I've kind of seen anti-Blackness move throughout our spaces. And I'm
Thanks, Araba. No, yeah, that was good. That was a good starter. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to build on the idea of invisibility. I think that one way that anti-Blackness shows up is the expectation of cultural assimilation. We're often not seen at all, no matter what culture it is. It could be Colombia, all of Latin America, all of, people don't believe that we exist, Mexico, people don't believe that there are Black folks in those spaces. And so when we do show up in shelters or programs, people don't really know what to do with us. And there is the expectation that you are going to assimilate into the culture, but it's usually within the Black American culture that you're expected to assimilate into. And then to add into what you're talking about, the diaspora wars, I have had, the way that I explain it, that I would explain it now, is that it always felt like I was being pulled from all sides, because I am a Black immigrant and I actually was born in Haiti and moved here in the mid 80s. And in the mid 80s, some of you might know, I'm aging myself, but that's okay. Aging is beautiful. The mid 80s was at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic and also the crack cocaine epidemic. And so I moved here during that time, and a lot of Haitians there was a huge stigma attached to being Haitian at that time, because there was this false belief that AIDS actually started in Haiti. So I was always teased in middle school and told to go back to my country because I had AIDS. But then I also heard from my family that they saw themselves as superior to Black Americans, as you said earlier. And they were very mean, like they said some very derogatory things about Black Americans. They believe Black Americans were aggressive, criminals, lazy, and just basically bad influence, which was what Reagan actually was saying about people who were impacted by the crack cocaine epidemic at that time. And so I internalized pretty much everything, especially when I was being bullied by Black Americans. I was told to go back to Africa, and I was always confused because I was like, I am African because I'm Black, but I'm actually from, the islands of the Caribbean. And so I was told that I wasn't Black enough. And so that goes back to being rendered invisible, right? And what does your Blackness look like? Chimamanda talks about that in Americana, where she's like, I came to the US and then I realized that I was like, I'm Black now in the United States. And there's a very specific definition of what Blackness is. And when I say that I'm being pulled from all sides, to me, the impact is a feeling of exclusion on one side. And as a teenager, I wanted to embrace the Black culture, but I was punished for it. I used to listen to Eazy-E, and I got kicked out of the house for listening to one of his songs one day. And it was a huge thing with my family. But there's also the feeling of not belonging anywhere, especially in Black spaces, when people are like definitely telling me to my face, you're not Black. This is until like even I would say about a couple of years ago, where I was told like, you're not Black, you're Haitian. And so, going back to just the impact, it makes you feel excluded, but that you don't necessarily belong anywhere.
All right. And also, I would like to add on media coverage and the value of advocates and tours to the Black diasporas. Those two main things. When I said media coverage, even like the coverage, like we're not even like exist sometimes, like what's happening in like the reality that is happening in real life in Africa and what has been covered here. And so especially with the mainstream medias. And so it's truly like we can see that it's like we have been experienced, we have been there. It's like our homeland, we have family there. I'll be like, really? Oh my God. So definitely it totally doesn't not make sense. But do we have control over it? No. But it still takes time to work on that. And even between the wars and anything, it's all about looking as different. When I say different, like looking as I don't have no words to describe that, but definitely it makes a lot of huge difference in the around the media coverage, especially those mainstreams. In the small medias that we cooperate and we work with, and they don't have much followers or much attentions. And these days media is a huge turnover in terms of anti-Blackness and even like anti-Africans, anything like that. So in terms of the value advocates towards to the Black diaspora that we work with, even it's very challenging myself being advocate and work with my fellow Africans. Even looking for services and looking for the resources for culture specific program is like labeled as a different, like a second citizen, just getting some kind of way systematically that kicks us out. It just gives us more challenge. So it matters, you know, who we work with, who we partner with, at what resource we look for, and definitely from the perspective that the survivors that we've been work with. We have survivors which is undocumented and documented. For those, it's add more pressure to even look for resources. We have to navigate that. Who do we work with? Do we work with, you know, the service providers who report that or not? We have to do our homeworks and not to risk more or harm the survivors or more, make them feel even bad. They already felt that. And so definitely we have to make sure that we work with us culture specific program, and even seeing to those, the media coverage that I just add on to that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Noai. And so you already actually started, Noai was just speaking about some of the barriers that exist for survivors and immigrant survivors specifically. Can you all talk to us a little bit more about what some of those barriers look like, systemically, how we can do better to respond to those needs as well?
Yeah, I would say there's a few barriers that come to mind. I'll start with the most obvious one. And Lucane, I think you touched a little bit on this, but language access services is clearly the most obvious barrier that a lot of immigrant populations face. A colleague and I just recently conducted listening sessions in the Bay Area. And what was really highlighted is marginalized groups are literally in danger because of limited access to the specific things that they need. So some of the individuals that we talked to that were experiencing violence, they did not have access to translators or interpreters. A lot of resources within their housing developments was not translated effectively in their language, right? And so they were not receiving information in a timely manner, or they were not receiving the information at all. And so this poses a huge threat to their survival, their actual survival. And so, yeah, that's a huge thing, is language access. And when we say language access, and we might talk about it a little bit more, but that's not just providing interpretation services, right? But it's, do your organizations have language access plans? Do your organizations have committees to not only implement services, but monitor these services for efficacy and accuracy? So that's one thing. And then also, there are a few cultural barriers that immigrant populations face as well. I can speak, I'm always going to go back to my West African culture, but there's a lot of value placed on marriage, especially for African women. And so that might limit a survivor's ability to seek services because of the shame that comes with a failed marriage, or the shame that comes with enduring abuse, or the normalization of abuse within certain African communities, right? So what we identify as abuse here in the US, in certain African communities, it's seen as discipline. So even just navigating those types of barriers, and how do you kind of like permeate social structures with also understanding how that society is structured. Like, I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's just so many things that go into how to like adequately help a survivor, considering cultural factors. So that's two. And then also, I would say a barrier is certain advocates not knowing how to navigate specific needs that immigrant survivor may need. For example, how do you help a survivor who's undocumented? Like, I think if we were to ask someone on the spot, it's just like, unless you are within legal services or you're a lawyer like Allison, you might not know, right? And so these are some of the things that, are being faced by our immigrant survivors. And I also want to say limited information of experiences about abuse, but I'm trying to like piece everything together without like going on tangents. But I think mainly due to like the similarity to race to Black Americans, Africans are often like lumped in research wise or research purposes for research purposes. And, you know, the exclusive needs of Africans go unaccounted for. And so that is something that also needs to be worked in, is we need to expand research within African communities to better service those populations. Todd G. Hamilton talks about this in Immigration and the Remaking of Black America, is that we do not have accurate information about immigrant populations, because when we say Black community, we often just refer to African Americans, and that excludes African immigrants, Caribbeans, Afro-Latin, even first, second generation. That's a whole identity in and of itself. And so, yeah, just a whole lot, but I'm not going to ramble anymore.
No, yeah, you brought up a lot of good points. I was like, ooh, and this, and this, and this. Yeah, thank you. Other folks?
I just want to add to that, the language access. My mom says she says this thing to me all the time. You don't have to speak English or another language to know this is food. Like, I want to eat, I'm hot, or whatever, I'm cold, whatever it is, there are things that you can understand, and there are great tools now for translation, but we have to move beyond that. I just want to applaud you for bringing that up. We have to move beyond just language or telephonic interpretation, because sometimes we don't realize that if we don't think about people like every day, how they're living their lives every day, then we're not really going to meet their needs. For example, if you have children, how are you communicating with the schools? The schools ask a lot of a parent, right? And so the schools might be assuming that you don't necessarily care about your kids' education, but you do. It's just that you're not, you don't feel as confident, because it's hard to speak or communicate with the teachers. But there are a lot of immigrant folks who move beyond that. They'll go sit in the classroom if their kids are having like behavioral issues, they don't care. And so I have seen immigrants, we have to think of like the strength base too. I have seen Black immigrants actually say, forget this, I don't care what's going on, I'm going to the school to handle this, right? But I think, like I said, moving beyond language, as we think of language, I think the barrier is more on us. We put the barrier there. I remember running a housing program in DC, and we had a client who spoke Amharic. I don't speak Amharic. I might speak like 3 other languages, but I was like, she's coming to the program. She fits for the program. And everyone else in the program was like, how is this going to work? How is she going to attend therapy? I'm like, okay, she may not want therapy, okay? Like, not everybody.
Right, let's start there.
Let's start there. Like, not everybody wants to talk. Talk therapy is not always important to everyone. So culturally, you have to think about that. And so, but we did talk to her and said, did you want anybody? And made sure she had a culturally, someone who spoke Amharic, but also culturally understood where she came from. People are not monoliths, right? They're not like, just because they're from part of the continent, that this is exactly who who you need. You have to think about language, but also culturally, do they fit? Like, even in Spanish, there's so many different dialects, right? Exactly. So we have to really meet them. When people say meet them where they are, they really mean that. Like, we had to make it so that she doesn't have to go to parenting classes, because she was like, I want a job. That's what I want. If you can get me a job, that's important. As far as like being an attorney, I think in America, we don't always, and I say we, all of us, because I don't want to put anyone down, understand the immigration system. People don't know what a green card is. They don't know that that card has not been green since I don't know what year, that it's not really a green card, that you don't really need an attorney, but some people do need attorneys. Excuse me, I'm not trying to say to the attorney on the panel that you don't need attorneys, but you do. For a lot of reasons, but sometimes it is really about going online, reading the form to help people in the community to fill out the form. A lot of immigrants do it for each other. It might take your program going to the community to find out who in the community is helping people fill out forms. Trust me, there's always one or two people doing that. Okay, so those are some of the things that I wanted to talk about. But lastly, close out by saying, and with this particular subject, is there's a lack of respect for cultural practices. Oftentimes we think about things in a way that's really negative, whereas like people from Francophone countries, for example, may not think about mutilation as a word that they would use. They might say cutting, genital cutting instead of mutilation. But in the way that we do the work in our movement, we see it, again, it's not strength-based. We're not working with the culture. We don't really respect the cultural practices. We don't look at people's spiritual practices as something that they value, especially if it's something we don't understand. So that's the last point that I wanted to make about in terms of barriers to services.
I guess I'll just jump in and add that I think it's important to look at the ways in which anti-Blackness can present barriers to survivors seeking help and support. And you know, the way we see this in our work is that much like Black African-American women are often reluctant to call the police because for a host of reasons, right? They worry about being criminalized themselves. They worry about, you know, police brutality and what the police might do when they show up to their partner. They worry about cultural stigma for involving the police in your business in the first place. And I think for Black immigrants, you know, there are concerns about involving law enforcement. There's fear around involving law enforcement, especially when you look at the ways in which anti-Blackness in the criminal justice system and the immigration system affect Black immigrant survivors. You know, the data is telling us that Black immigrants find themselves in removal proceedings for criminal violations and convictions 76% of the time, versus 45% for all other immigrants. So we know that racism, structural racism, anti-Blackness is showing up in spaces that affect Black immigrants. And when we talk about Black immigrant survivors, I think as advocates and as service providers, we have to make sure that we're doing all we can to remove those barriers, looking at our internal policies. Are we creating policies that are forcing survivors to align with systems that are not supportive, that are actually hostile and dangerous for them to reach out to? And specifically, I'm talking about the practice of some programs requiring things like police reports or restraining orders as a prerequisite to services, right? And so just, you know, from a provider perspective, also being intentional about outreaching and meeting survivors where they are. You know, I did an internal search of all of the Black immigrant survivors we've worked with, and every single one of them found their way to us, not because they called the police or reached out for help, but because somebody else called the police on their behalf. That's problematic. And to me, what that says is that there are survivors that are struggling without any help and support, and that there are real barriers, whether it's systemic, cultural, religious, to Black immigrant survivors being able to access services and support. And so we as providers have to be intentional about breaking down those barriers and meeting survivors where they are, whether that's through language access, specific and intentional outreach practices. And then when they come to us, ensuring that our environment is one that is culturally responsive and sensitive and welcoming.
So I'm having a lot of thoughts as you all are talking. I had to start writing stuff down because I'm like, there's so much going on. So someone in the chat actually asked a question that was actually where I was going with my questioning. The question is, well, the comment is, how is the narrative in the research world, service provision, response sector generally, that Black immigrants are hard to reach or not responsive or not cooperative, harmful to those in the community? Why is this narrative so common and widely used? And before folks jump in, when you all were speaking, I was actually really thinking about the notion of thankfulness and the notion of lying or like scamming systems, right? Which, when I think about thankfulness, I see it as in many ways, so the way I'm framing it, in many ways connected to white supremacy of like, you should be thankful for your freedom. You should be thankful that you're here. So like, don't complain, take the resources that we offer you. If they're not good enough or if they're not exactly what you need, like, oh, well. That to me is like very much white supremacy, very much anti-Blackness, very much rooted in some advocacy principles even that aren't actually helpful to survivors. And so if you all had thoughts on that, and then the other piece, just the other side of that is around lying or like not being truthful or not being cooperative, or not willing to engage systems, like that narrative about survivors. If you all wanted to unpack that a little more.
Sure, I think I can go with that. And so to me, like, who approached them, right? And so who's doing the research and why the research is going to be done. So we have to be mindful of, educating them and why the research is going to be conducted and who's conducting and why we are using the research. And so, and even like, we have to know where the community is located and where we can find them. And like, for example, we are located in Washington, D.C. So in Washington, D.C. area, the survivors we work with, they don't reach out to us directly. So we reach out to their churches and or some community gatherers. We don't show up, say, hey, I'm from DV service providers. No, we are here to empower women and share our services that we provide. If you are interested, if you know someone, you can share, or you can take these brochures home, you can read through and give back to me. So that's the outreach that how, I conduct and we conduct, that's a TPC. And so even the survivors more trust or more comfortable to reach out to their pastors or priests or, go to their church and someone they loves than even reach out to service providers. Why? Maybe we are mandated reporter, so we can report. And so maybe they are undocumented. Even like they feel like when someone reach out to them, it feels like stranger. And someone walk and knock my door, I don't open the door. Like these days, they just walk and knock the door, and I don't open my doors. And my little baby, you run around, "Mommy, stranger." I'm like, okay, that's okay. So yeah, and so, but if I feel this person is, safe that I can open maybe door and talk to, maybe I can. But I have to see who that person is, why he's walking around. And definitely. So it matters where we conduct and how we reach out to them. And we have to educate them as well. Like education is very important. We have to educate them and let them know and acknowledge that this is confidential and this is, we don't disclose, but just being transparent, and this is what we use for, and you cooperate with us. And most of them, we can't reach them because they do survivor jobs. So they don't work 9 to 5. They don't work 7 to 3. So, or the parents, work hard, survivor jobs, and they're not even home. So we can't reach them. They work Saturday and Sunday. So we can't find them to get those data and research.
Mhm.
And so we have to look at it, at how we can conduct the research.
I agree. And I would also add on, EY, to that. I'm very huge on providing context, especially in research. And I think often with westernized research, it lacks context. It really lacks context, and that kind of like irks me. And Chimamanda Ngozi speaks to the dangers of half-truths and
Yes.
why denying full truths denies the person of their full humanity, because you're not able to see the full story. And so even if this narrative is true, right, that the Black immigrant population is hard to reach, they're non-cooperative, they're non-responsive, are you asking why? Are you studying their culture to understand why? So I recently read a report that spoke to this very thing, about the mistrust that African communities have with law enforcement, systemic officials who try to solicit this information. And also just the culture of, when you report certain things, you may be ostracized from your family and community. And so they have to navigate that and be very careful about who they speak to and how they speak to these people. So we're leaving out that complete context that paints the picture as to why the response might not be up to this research standard. So I just wanted to add that tidbit, is like, we have to make sure we're situating this in context.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts before we move on?
Well, I just think, assuming that, working with Black immigrant survivors is difficult, is anti-Black itself, because it's basically perpetuating, stereotypes and fosters exclusion, as we've talked about. And we have to work better at being inclusive, not just because, we've talked about tokenism all the time, but being more inclusive in the way that we do our work. So that's, for the sake of time, that's what I'll say.
And this question isn't actually on our list, but I'm going to ask it because I know you all can answer it. Can you talk a little bit more? So we've talked about anti-Blackness generally. Can you also talk about how it shows up in organizational spaces, between coworkers, across organizations, and some ways to address it? Maybe address it.
I'll jump in here. I always think back to the story that our CEO, Karen Earl, tells about the time she was in a meeting of shelter directors. And one white director stood up and unabashedly stated, "My staff does not work well with Black women," and did not find anything problematic or concerning about making that statement at all. And there was no rebuke or pushback, from that statement being made. And so I think, Genesee, as a organization founded by Black women for Black women, had to be courageous and buck against what was seen as best practices at the time, and do what made sense culturally for the population that we were founded to serve, and to not be locked into, the tradition of the time of requiring, certain things upon entrance to the program, or mandating that, they participate in certain programs as a condition of remaining in the program, but really taking a look at what are the needs of this community that we're serving, and not being afraid to design our program in a way that is meeting those needs. And so I think when we talk about the ways in which anti-Blackness, show up, it needs to be calling it out and not being afraid to stand up and stand on an island, because for a long time, Genesee was on an island, and there was a lot of criticism about certain practices that we refused to engage in. And now, those practices, what we did many years ago, are now seen as best practices and, victim-centered, survivor-centered, trauma-informed. And that was language we didn't even know at the time. It was just about being responsive and willing to stand in solidarity with the community that we were a part of and were there to serve. And so that's what I'll say about that.
Thank you. I think that's just such a good reminder that, yes, we're doing work with survivors, and there are people in our organizations that also have these identities and layers. And even if it's not our own experience, you're never going to understand survivors and folks out there if you can't even talk to people in your org, or you can't even understand, their identities, their lived experience, why, certain scents might be going in their office, why they might be eating certain foods in the office, and not being able to celebrate all those things. It gets harder to celebrate it for survivors. And so I think being able to have these conversations internally as orgs is really important. So I appreciate that. And then also just the reevaluation of what our best practices, or if there are practices happening here, is it a best practice? Is it culturally responsive or nuanced? Is it trauma informed? Are we appreciating that there are going to be responses to whatever this is, right? And those responses can also still be valid. So there's a lot to talk through when we get through all this. So thank you. Any last thoughts? There's some other questions actually from the audience that I want to make sure we turn to as well.
Well, I think, maybe not in our workplaces in Maryland at the network. We've working really hard on addressing the issue of leadership in the movement. And so I just wanted to uplift that and say that there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the movement itself. And, there was that article that came out in Washington, at the Washington Coalition Against Sexual Assault, where the folks experience a lot of anti-Blackness. And I think in our work in general, in our movement, we need to do better with leadership and uplifting folks of color, but also specifically Black folks in the movement. I think there's maybe 10% of us who are folks of color who are in leadership positions.
So I see a comment. I think people have to understand that just because we come with a helper hat on, it doesn't mean a community of people automatically see that person as that. Trust is not assigned by the role, but relationship. So again, speaking exactly to what you were all saying, absolutely. And I see another comment. What ways do you think the Black American community can better support the African community or others within the diaspora?
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
Sorry, would you like to go first?
Oh, I was, echoing you saying it's a great question.
Oh, yeah, I think just being survivor-centered is a starting point, right? And also enlightening yourself on the cultural background, the practices, the values, the belief systems of that person. Be holistic in your approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the misconceptions, or some of the misconceptions that advocates have when working with Black immigrant survivors often is that, I've worked with one, I've worked with them all. But no, that's not true, right? We often say Black people are not a monolith. Well, immigrants are not monolithic either. There are many different experiences and needs. And, you've heard this many times before. Africa is a continent, it's not a country. And so there are different people of many languages, many belief systems, many needs and experiences. And so really just make sure you're centering the person, and not the whole, I guess, like cultural background. And then also being aware of your own biases and stigmas. Even as an advocate myself, that's something I have to be aware of. One thing my mom like loves to say to me, she's like, you think you know everything, right? And she says this in conversation to me because I often assume things of the older generation within my culture, not to take into account how people are ever growing, they're ever changing. And so certain stigmas that are attributed to, certain cultures and generations, that might not hold true. And then also, where are you getting this information from? Just because you've seen this or you've heard this, it doesn't necessarily mean this is a reflection of that person's identities, their needs, and their experiences. So just being very survivor-centered and taking the extra step or going the extra mile to learn the person. You might have worked with a Ghanaian American, but a Ghanaian American's experiences will be different from someone who just migrated from Kenya. So yeah, just doing that extra work to learn about the person.
Thank you, Araba. I just want to add into that. And so you see it clearly. And, the person, being the name of our organization, the person center, right? So just human first, the person center. Definitely, I have been experienced that, we are culture specific program, but working or being partnership with different service providers and loudly clear and say, do I look like African immigrant that I'm doing this work? I'm like, well, so why are you here? Like, why you do the work? Still you do the work, but if you feel like, if you ask yourself that you look like African, so definitely just work the best interest of the survivors and respect the difference and accommodate their needs. Something that is okay here and it's not okay back home in some practice, some cultures and beliefs. So I always be mindful. I'm from Ethiopia, which is East African, but we have a different language, like 80 plus. I don't speak those languages, but I just speak two. Definitely, if I have more survivors who reach out to speak different languages, we have to get language access. And are there those translators are trained trauma-informed care, since we are providing trauma-informed care service providers. So we have to do those homeworks and reach out and then accommodate and facilitate that. Even the survivors scared to seek services because I'm already labeled as immigrant survivors, or I'm already not worth person. I'm not worthy. So, if I go, nobody help. Still, they doubt. We have to, prove that as service providers, like we're not, we are here to support, we are here to help. And so whatever reason, it could be, the trauma they have been facing, it could be the mental health, it could be whatever reason that, the outcomes. It would be a challenge, but at the end of the day, they're so grateful and they're so thankful, but it takes harder to get into that point, even for advocate and for the survivors. And so even like the timing, myself, when I went back home for vacation, nobody keep up with me. I'm too fast. When I walk, oh my gosh, everybody's so late and everybody eats so slowly. Everybody take their time to drink coffee. Oh my God, nobody keep up with me. I'm too fast. So I make sure So they have said loudly so many times. At this time, I put my family together. I said, Dad, Mom, please don't think that I'm ill mentally. I'm okay. Seriously, the night we arrived. So, that's normal in America. That's the way we do the work. That's, the lifestyle we live. I'm adapted to that country. I say, please be with me. That's what I say clearly. So, and next day, my brothers, nobody keep up with, I'm too fast. So I have to take my time, even like trying to adjust to that systems. So in terms of the survivors, when they come to this country, face those challenges to the services, that's not the response they get, because we don't have much resources on our hand in the system that has been designed. If need is housing, we can get them right away. No, anything like that. So everything has policy and procedures, as Messenger said early about the requirement that we have been designed that we have to work on internally in our organization. Definitely that matters. So I believe serving African immigrants is just treat them and just value and appreciate even they are here to seek the services. I'm so grateful you are here for the services, because they don't reach out, to be honest. Definitely. So we lost many of them, and so we have to be just mindful of their cultures and respect. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, yes. I love that. It is very fast in the US. And I love going back home to Haiti because I just want to take deep breaths. I would say for me, I'm just going to speak from my own personal experience. I would I identify as Haitian American, but in terms of Black Americans, I would say lean in with curiosity and ask questions. Ask as many questions as possible. And not assume that what you've seen in the media or what you've heard is necessarily the truth. Like I don't have a little puppet or with pins and with your name on it because I'm from Haiti, that I practice that. That's not even part of our spiritual practice. The voodoo doll, I think it's made, is a Hollywood made thing, in fact. It has nothing to do with any of the practices that are similar to voodoo either. But ask questions, ask what more questions about that, the spiritual practices. I would say also lean in with similarities that we might have, especially in the things that we might celebrate, whether it's food or also our history. Things we might be proud of in our history. Lean in, and ask questions about our struggles. A lot of times we don't realize that we have those similarities. And I actually just posted on Facebook about the color purple. I just realized that there's a line in there where Mr. tells Celie, you are poor. He says, you're poor, you're ugly, you're Black, ain't nobody gonna want you. And she said, she did her thing and said, I may be poor, I may be Black, and I may be ugly, but I'm here, right? and it's just right, like you remember that line. And in Haiti we have the same line, and it's nous l'aide, nous la. We might be ugly, but we're here. And it's about resilience, right? We have gone through a lot, but we're here. We exist, and we've made it. And so, have those conversations about, where our struggles intersect, because there's much more about that. We have more similar than we have in terms of like differences. But, if you lean in with curiosity, we learn those things about each other. So that's what I would say in terms of my relationship, building a relationship with more Black Americans.
I'll just add, I love everything that you just said, Lucane. It really resonated with me. And I think that as Genesee and I as an individual try to move into the space of being more intentional about working with Black immigrant survivors, your advice to find the similarities and where our experiences intersect, but also not to assume that just because we are all Black, that our experiences, our values, our beliefs and practices are the same, and to not see that as a negative, but as a point of a curiosity to learn another culture and to find those alignments. And so I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also add too, I agree with everything that everyone has said. I would also quickly add, just be intentional about your partnerships. So I know that's one thing that, Ujima is definitely really good at doing, is like, we partner often with the person center because we know that they work day in and day out with victims in African immigrant populations. And so just be very intentional about who you're partnering with.
And just the last piece from everything that you all were saying, it again, it got me thinking about a lot of things. I would say as a Black American, checking your privilege and like leaning into that curiosity is probably one of the most useful tools you'll have as an advocate, actually. My husband is Haitian, and so we've had a lot of conversations about what privilege looks like here in the US, what privilege looks like in Haiti, across generations, across communities. To LaCane's point, if you are assuming that everyone on the island of Haiti practices voodoo, like maybe do some more research into what that looks like, right? Like maybe do more research into the connection with Haitian liberation, like maybe do more research into, connection with family legacy and what that means, right? But also understand that there are a large percentage of people on the island that are Christian and strictly Christian and absolutely will not engage with those practices, right? And so just broadening your understanding of like what community looks like, what culture looks like, what family relationships look like, not assuming that it's just going to show up in the same ways. And then even when we think about Black American identities, to remember that there are a lot of different ways to be Black American here too, right? Of not everybody's gonna be from New York or Baltimore or LA or DC. Like we have some deep South Texans that are like living and not really being acknowledged for their cultural experiences. So to be open, be curious, like Kane said, dig in, ask questions, check your privilege, like do more research. Like there are a lot of great writers, Black writers that should be your reference points. That can really speak to culture, really speak to the nuances happening in communities. A lot of Black women writers all over the world have like specifically and explicitly talked about violence and how it shows up in different communities, and how it shows up as immigrant women, as Black women all over the world. And so again, being curious, being open, pushing yourself to learn and grow, like those are all really great resources as advocates to like your self-work that you have to do. So thank you all for that piece. I think it was really important. Another question, and again, thinking about systems generally, do you have some recommendations or suggestions for survivors who are navigating, they said, the family policing system? So, child protective services or just policing in general. Do you have any thoughts around ways in which their advocates can help them navigate the system, or they generally, what resources folks can look into?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Let me go back up to it 1 second. Do you have any recommendations, suggestions, or resources for folks who are navigating the police system, criminal legal system, or child welfare? Rephrase it. There we
That are immigrants. So we'll leave that to Allison.
I would say it's so important to to have an advocate, someone who is going to partner with you to help tell your story and to explain, cultural nuances that might explain behaviors and how things that could be seen as abuse or neglect here are not seen that way in other countries and cultures. So really having an advocate that understands your cultural framework and can help you share that with the systems that you are having to navigate is so key. And as advocates, it's incumbent upon us to take the time to lean in, to learn, to understand, to do the research so that we can be an effective voice for survivors who are trying to navigate systems that are not always understanding or affirming, and many times downright hostile to Black survivors, and particularly Black immigrant survivors. So I would say really partnering with culturally responsive and aware advocates in these situations is key.
Absolutely. And we will be sharing out some resources in a little bit after this webinar is shared, and we are sharing the recording as well for folks who are asking. Another piece of that I was thinking of in terms of advocating or helping folks navigate the system is sometimes really like, even if someone reads in English, for example, you still might have to tell them what it means. Like, if there's one thing where it says, and it's another thing to understand what it actually means to your experience. The other piece that I always think about is around informed consent. And people do, in my opinion, generally a horrible job at giving informed consent to survivors. And so survivors will start to tell their stories and disclose and get into nitty-gritty details. And sometimes not even the down and dirty details. They might be sharing the story generally. And because we're mandated reporters in many spaces, we are prompted, because of our policies or protocols or whatever, prompted to file a report where we didn't inform the survivor to begin with that was a possibility. So right there, we're already acting against our own rapport and trust building. And so to really explain to someone, because when you say all of this is confidential, they're thinking everything then is actually confidential. And so it comes as a surprise. It in many ways harms folks. We know there's overrepresentation of Black children just generally in the child welfare system. And so again, if you're really working with survivors, make sure that they understand that there are a variety of outcomes that could happen if they give you certain access to information. You can work around a lot of things. It's really hard to work around distrust when there's no effort to actually build that trust back up. And so I'll just add that I've seen it in direct service many a time. And it again really impacts the community way more than folks think, because to Lucane's point, we know that there are folks in the community doing this work. We know that there are folks, telling, so-and-so how to navigate this system. And if it goes around the community, you can't trust this program because they're going to take your kids, or you can't trust the police because they're going to snatch your kids. Then again, we're really just co-conspiring with the abusive partner, in my opinion. And so to think about where it causes harm, how it is, how trauma again is going to show up. And then to think about just the different outlets that happen, like we really have to do our self-work, and we really have to make sure we're being clear and communicative to people in a full way. Let me just double check and see. There was a question about speakers' names and contact information being shared. Yes, we will share it. If our presenters here, if you all wanted to drop your contact information in the chat, please do. We also, again, we will be sharing out some resource lists. We have some fact sheets coming as well that will be published shortly, so stay tuned for that. The recording will be shared. I see some folks dropping their contact information, so thank you. I think that was the good majority of those questions. So as we're closing out, I just wanted to take a few moments for us to really think about
I just wanted to uplift the Upend movement. It's up, endmovement.org. They talk about the removal or surveillance of Black families. That's a really good resource that I would recommend to kind of follow, what kind of policies they're recommending, and just learning more about that. So I put it in the chat.
Yes. And any other resources anyone wants to share, feel free to drop them in the chat. But as we're closing out, for us to think about some of those short-term and long-term action steps that advocates can take to better address the needs of survivors. Any thoughts around that? Short-term or long-term strategies? And they can be like detailed, or they can be like, hey, simple, quick fix to like reach folks better, wherever you want to go with it.
I would definitely say embrace intersectionality. I would be remiss if I didn't bring that up, that, it's important that, sometimes advocates overlook intersectionality of identities within the Black immigrant community. So it's important to embrace that. And also, recognizing that there are limited access to resources. There is limited access to resources, but to be creative as well, to try to problem solve and work with the strength of the community rather than looking at it as a weakness that, people are not coming to the program. So try to be creative. One example I would say is I worked with the Ethiopian Cultural Community Center. It may not work for everybody, but it did work with that particular client that I worked with. And they provided free interpretation service and connected us to other folks in the community who are willing to help. Again, you have to ask the survivor, because not everybody wants the communities to know their their business, and in fact may feel embarrassed. But when you're being creative, you're working and co-creating with the client, as opposed to thinking that, you're the helper and you have to have all the answers. So.
Yeah, that's good. So I would say, and don't laugh at me, y'all, but money talks. So if you are serious about elevating the needs and experiences of survivors, create funding streams for survivors, right? So if a survivor needs to escape their abuser and needs rental assistance, or needs to make the first month's rent, can you pull from a funding stream to assist? If they need legal services, what are your contacts? Right. So I would say work on creating funding streams specifically for immigrant survivors. I would also say try to expand as much as possible in your research initiatives, so that resources can be readily available for organizations who need to refer to those resources. And also, like I said earlier, be very intentional about who you're partnering with to create these resources. So that you are well informed, right? Because we know there's a lack of research within immigrant population communities. And so are you partnering with centers who have that day in and day out experience working with the immigrant population? Yeah, I would say that's it for me. Oh, also, as the great philosopher Solange Knowles said, for us, by us, okay? And so evaluate your staff. Are you hiring staff who reflects the communities that you serve, right? And it's not enough to say that you are for the immigrant community, but do you work with the immigrant community, right? Do you work with people who are in proximity to the immigrant community? So evaluate who is sitting on your staff who can speak directly to the needs and experiences of survivors, not just for symbolic purposes, but to really enhance and amplify their specific and unique needs.
I would just add to what has already been said, that it starts with recognition, right? I think one of my first comments was about invisibility. So once we recognize the need to center the voices and the experiences of Black immigrant survivors, I think from there, it's going to take resilience on the part of advocates working within organizations to really create a service model that is welcoming and receptive to Black immigrant survivors. You know, when you look at it from a programmatic standpoint, you talk about building out your program for a whole nother population. Sometimes you can get resistance internally in terms of what that looks like in terms of funding and resources. But I think being willing to push against that resistance, not that I'm experiencing that at Genesee Center, fortunately, but others in their organizations may, and just being willing to push against that resistance so that, again, the experiences of Black immigrant survivors are being centered and considered and attended to.
And so I just want to add into that. So for the short term, of course, around you know, flexibility of the service that we provide. You know, some of the funds are not, you know, flexible. So if they or you know, the organization work around those flexible funds. Some of the survivors request for transportation, some for education materials, some for childcare or something like that as survivors. So definitely, if there is no policy and procedures that can force to you know, exclude that survivors, that would be great. And in terms of the long-term building the tool like that can supportive to the culture specific service providers. For example, you know, demographic area, research needs, and even like why the survivors cannot, you know, reach out. What's wrong? Like, what's the problem? Like, even those research, even like we don't have like data that, you know, detailed data about African immigrant diaspora around DV survivors. Like, we don't have accurate data, or we don't have data that has been developed by or researched by Black advocates or Black researchers. So definitely it would help us to even serve more or provide services to survivors. So even for whether for funds or for the work that we do, research is very important. So definitely look into that, and then having that tool every time like we design something to work on, we don't have to look for. So we still have that data. So as an sisters organization, as you know, for example, we work with Ujima and other service providers, so we can develop that, and then every time. So we can you know, have that tool, just, you know, develop and updates, and then work on that, and so leave for the next generations, you know, the next advocates and the next survivors. So definitely we are, you know, here to end the violence, but still we are facing challenges. It takes time, so definitely having those resources may be helpful from the work that I do.
Well, on that note, thank you all. I feel like this was an amazing conversation. I could talk for a long time, so I'm not going to do it to you all. But this was an amazing conversation. I know folks in the chat and Q&A were also commenting. We will definitely, again, folks, be sharing this out. Everyone here is a resource to you all, and so definitely reach out. They do their own work as well as organizational work, and so really being connected and in community together is going to just help us with our advocacy and make sure we're centering Black immigrant survivors' needs and realities. So thank you all so much. We appreciate you. We will have you back for more conversation, of course, because we're friends and you can't escape us. But again, we appreciate you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.